At the divorce hearing, my wife bragged, "Today is the best day of my life. I will take the house, the kids, and half the company." Hello, Smirked. My lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Did you follow my plan?" I nodded, and the divorce became her nightmare. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. She was sitting on the other side of the room with a smile I'd never seen on her before. It wasn't my wife's smile. It was the smile of someone who thinks she's already won. She leaned toward her lawyer, said something quietly, and they both laughed. Then she looked up at me, straight into my eyes, and said loudly, "Scoundrel," without hesitating for a second. "Today is the best day of my life." The room fell silent. Judge Hortensia looked up from her papers. The assistant stopped typing. I didn't move a muscle. Adriana kept talking in that voice I knew so well. That voice she used when she was sure of something. "I'm going to walk out of here with the house, with the kids, and with half the company he built. Everything." In the gallery at the back of the room, Orlando was sitting with his arms crossed. He smiled, an ironic, slow smile, like someone who already knows how the movie ends. He stared at me as if to say, "You've already lost, old man." And then Ruben, my lawyer, leaned toward me very slowly and whispered in my ear with a calmness that at that moment seemed almost supernatural. "Did you follow the plan to the letter?" I nodded once, without taking my eyes off Adriana. "Perfect," he said, arranging his papers on the table with a tranquility that contrasted with everything in that room. "The show begins now." I took a deep breath and thought about everything it had taken to get to that moment, about the 8 months of silence, about the nights I stayed awake reviewing documents instead of crying, about the times I saw her come home late and said nothing, asked nothing, didn't react, about the times Orlando waved at me at some event and I waved back as if I knew absolutely nothing. I thought about all that, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something like peace because Adriana believed today was her day. She believed she'd planned everything perfectly. She believed I was the same man as always, the one who worked in silence, the one who didn't ask questions, the one who trusted too much. But what she didn't know, what Orlando didn't know, what nobody in that room knew yet, was that I'd been preparing for exactly this moment for 8 months and I hadn't left anything to chance. Nothing. Let me tell you how I got here, because this story doesn't start in that cold room that smells of old paper. It starts on a Tuesday night, exactly 8 months ago, when I found something I shouldn't have found, and I made the most important decision of my life, not to say a single word. My name's Ernesto. I'm 48 years old. For 19 years, I was a husband, a father, and the sole provider for a family I thought I knew. I built a company from scratch, with my own hands, with years of work that started before dawn and ended when everyone at home was already asleep. I wasn't a millionaire, but I'd built something real, something solid, something that was worth something, something Adriana now wanted to split in half and take as if it were hers. Adriana and I met when we were both 29. She was a language teacher. I just opened my first office with a loan that took me 4 years to pay off. We got married quickly, maybe too quickly, but at that moment I was convinced I'd found the right person. We had 2 children, Angela, who's now 16, and David, who's 13. 2 children who at that moment were at home with my sister-in-law, not knowing their father was sitting in a hearing room about to watch their mother try to destroy him. For years I worked. Adriana stopped working when Angela was born and never went back. Not because I asked her to, but because she wanted to. I never approached her for anything, never asked her to account for anything, never asked her what she spent the money on that I transferred to her every month, which wasn't a small amount. I toasted here. Or I thought I did. The first 15 years were normal. Not perfect, but normal. There was distance, there were silences, there were nights when we were both in the same bed staring at the ceiling without saying anything, but I attributed it to tiredness, to routine, to that invisible thing that happens to marriages when the years pile up and daily life crushes everything else. It was in the 16th year that I started noticing small things, things I didn't know how to read at the time. The phone that was always face down on the table, the outings with friends that used to be once a month and suddenly were 3 times a week. The way she sometimes looked at me during dinner, Not with love or indifference, but with something I couldn't name, something like guilt or the relief that I didn't ask. I didn't ask, I never asked. Until one Tuesday night, 8 months ago, without looking for anything, without suspecting anything in particular, I found something that changed everything. And from that moment, my life was divided into two very clear parts: who I was before that night and what I became after. But I'll tell you that in a moment, because first I need you to understand something important. When people discover a betrayal, the natural reaction is to explode, to scream, to confront, to throw things, to call someone crying at 3 in the morning. I get it. It's human. It's what pain does to us when it hits suddenly and without warning. But I didn't do any of that, and that decision, that single decision to stay quiet that night and all the nights that followed, was what determined everything that happened later in that hearing room. Adriana thought she had me. Orlando thought they'd won before the game even started. And Ruben, my lawyer, the only one who knew everything, was sitting next to me with a folder full of things that were going to make that day remembered for a long time, just not in the way Adriana expected. It was a Tuesday, a completely ordinary Tuesday. That's what strikes me most when I remember it. It wasn't a special day. There were no signs. It didn't rain. There was no thunder. Nothing happened in the world to warn me that that night was going to be the before and after of my entire life. I got home at 9:30 at night. Late, as always. I'd had a long meeting with a supplier that went on longer than expected. And on the way, I stopped to buy something for dinner because I knew at that hour there'd be nothing left in the kitchen. Adriana didn't cook when I got home late. That was one of those unwritten rules that marriages build over the years without anyone ever saying them out loud. I came in quietly. The hallway light was off. Angela and David were already asleep. The house had that thick silence that only exists when everyone's resting, except you. I went to the kitchen, put the bag on the table, poured myself a glass of water, and then I heard something. It wasn't a loud noise. It was almost nothing. A short, repeated vibration coming from the living room sofa. I peeked in. Adriana wasn't there, but her phone she'd left it charging on the sofa, plugged into the wall, face up, which she never did. She always left it face down everywhere, on the dining room table, on the nightstand, in the bathroom, always face down. But not that night. The screen lit up with a message. I didn't look for it. I didn't go looking for it. It was just there, visible, on, with the sender's name perfectly legible from where I was standing, Orlando, and the message just said tomorrow, same time. I miss you. I stood motionless. I don't know how long I was like that, standing at the entrance to the living room with a glass of water in my hand, looking at that screen that had already turned off. It could have been a minute. It could have been 10. I don't know. Time does strange things when something hits you in the center of your chest and knocks the wind out of you. The first thing I felt wasn't rage. It was a kind of cold clarity, like when you turn on a light in a dark room and suddenly you can see exactly where everything is. Everything that was confusing before suddenly had shape. The face-down phones, the frequent outings, the looks during dinner, the distance I'd attributed to tiredness and the years. It wasn't tiredness. It was another person. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Adriana was coming from the bathroom. I turned off the living room light, took my bag from the kitchen, and went upstairs slowly, without making a sound, without saying anything. I went into the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and waited for her to come up. Adriana came into the room, saw me sitting there, and asked if everything was okay. I told her yes, that I was just tired. She got into bed. In 10 minutes, she was asleep. I didn't sleep all night. And as I listened to her breathe next to me, I made the most important decision I'd ever made in my life. I wasn't going to say anything. Not that night, not the next, not until I knew exactly what I was dealing with, exactly how far this went, exactly what was in front of me. Because I'd seen too many times what happens when a man reacts on impulse. I'd seen it in friends, in acquaintances, in stories that always end the same way. The one who explodes loses his head, loses the narrative, loses control of the situation. And at that moment, the only thing that was clear to me was that I couldn't afford to lose anything. I had a company, I had 2 kids, I had 19 years of a life I'd built. I wasn't going to destroy it all in one night of rage. The next day, I acted normally. I got up, had breakfast with the kids, gave Adriana a kiss on the cheek before leaving. As always, she smiled at me. A calm, carefree smile. The smile of someone who doesn't know the world has just changed. I got to the office, and the first thing I did was call David. David has been my best friend for over 20 years. No, not the David from the hearing. Don't get confused. That was my son. This David is another person, a lifelong friend, someone who knows me better than I know myself in many ways. He'd been the best man at my wedding. He'd been at the hospital when my children were born. He was the kind of friend who answers the phone at any hour without asking why. I told him I needed to see him. Just that. He didn't ask any more questions. He told me to meet him at lunchtime. We sat in a cafe far from the office, far from the neighborhood where we lived, far from any place where someone might recognize us. I told him what I'd seen. Just that, just a message, nothing more, because at that moment that was all I had. David listened to me without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a few seconds and then said something that stuck with me forever. Ernesto, what you do in the next few weeks will determine everything that comes after. Don't react. Investigate. He was right. And then David gave me a name, Ruben. Ruben was a lawyer, specializing in family law and asset protection. David had met him years ago on a complicated case and told me he was the best he'd ever seen work. Not the most famous, not the most expensive, the best. I called him that same afternoon. Ruben saw me 2 days later in his office. He was a man of about 55, calm, with thin-rimmed glasses and a way of speaking that conveyed the exact opposite of the panic I felt inside. He listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. He took notes. When I finished, he closed his notebook, looked at me, and said something that completely changed my understanding of what I was going through. The most costly mistake a man in your situation makes is acting before documenting. You have nothing yet, just a message. That's not enough. We need to build a case file. I asked him how long that would take. He answered without hesitation, as long as it takes. Can you stand living in that house without reacting? I thought of Angela, I thought of David, my son, I thought of the company. I can, I told him. And so it all began. Over the following weeks, I learned to observe in a way I'd never practiced. I learned to be present without being visible, to listen without seeming to listen, to note details that had previously gone completely unnoticed by me. For example, I discovered that Adriana went out on Tuesdays and Thursdays with the excuse of a yoga class she'd supposedly started 3 months ago. She'd never told me anything about that class. One day, while reviewing the statement for our shared card, I noticed there were no charges from any gym or yoga studio, nothing, not a single payment in 3 months. I wrote it down. I also noticed that every time Orlando was mentioned in any conversation, in any business meeting, in any context whatsoever, Adriana would subtly change the subject or simply not react. Too much of no reaction, like someone who's practiced not reacting. I wrote that down too. Ruben had told me something from the beginning that became my mantra during those months. Don't look to confirm what you already know. Look to discover what you don't know yet, because what you don't know yet is probably the most important thing. He was right, because what I didn't know yet at that moment was much worse than a simple message on a phone. Much worse, and I was about to find out. They're the type of pain that doesn't scream, it doesn't bend you over, it doesn't make you cry in the bathroom, it doesn't suddenly rob you of sleep. It's a silent, cold pain that settles slowly in the center of your chest and stays there, still, like a stone you learn to carry because you have no other choice. That's what I felt during those months. Every day, I got up, had breakfast with my kids, gave Adriana a kiss, went to work, lived my life, and nobody, absolutely nobody looking at me from the outside could have imagined what was happening inside, what I was building in silence, what I was uncovering layer by layer. Like someone peeling something that looks ordinary on the outside and is completely rotten on the inside. Ruben had given me clear instructions from the beginning. No confrontations, no sudden changes in behavior, nothing that could alert Adriana that something had changed in me. I had to continue being the same Ernesto as always, the one who worked too much, the one who arrived late, the one who didn't ask questions. And I was. My God, I was. There were nights when Adriana would come home with that sparkle in her eyes that I already knew wasn't for me. And I'd ask her how her day went, and she'd tell me some made-up story about her afternoon, and I'd nod and smile and tell her that was nice, and inside, I felt something I don't know whether to call rage or sadness or simply the brutal awareness that I was living next to a stranger. But I kept quiet because Ruben was right and David was right, and I knew it. It was in the fourth week when things started to get more serious. Ruben had suggested hiring someone who could document Adriana's movements discreetly and legally. He didn't give me unnecessary details. He just told me there were people who did that kind of work professionally, that everything obtained would be handled within the legal framework, and that he would present the results to me directly in our weekly meetings. I accepted. The first meeting after that was on a Thursday afternoon. Ruben placed a thin folder on his desk, not very thick yet, and told me to start at the beginning. The thing with Orlando wasn't new. That was the first thing he told me. It wasn't new. It had been going on, according to what they'd been able to establish so far, for about 2 years. 2 years. While I was working 12-hour days to support a house, pay for schools, build a company, Adriana had been with Orlando for 2 years. I stared at the folder without saying anything. 2 years. I did the mental calculation at that moment, sitting across from Ruben, and realized that 2 years ago had been one of the best periods for my company. We'd closed a major contract. We'd grown. I come home one night with a bottle of wine to celebrate, and Adriana had toasted with me with a smile. That same Adriana. At that very same time, she was already with Orlando. I took a deep breath. There's more, Ruben said. There's always more. Orlando wasn't just my wife's lover. Orlando was the majority partner of a competing company in the same sector I operated in. He'd been trying for years to enter markets where I already had a presence, and according to what Ruben had started to trace, there were certain movements in my company's contracts that didn't quite add up. Small things, details that separately meant nothing, but together began to paint a picture that chilled my blood. Clients who'd stopped renewing contracts without a clear reason. A key supplier who'd suddenly preferred to work with the competition after years of relationship with us. Information about bids I'd lost by very small margins, as if someone had known exactly how much I was offering and had offered a little less. I asked Ruben directly if he was saying what I thought he was saying. He looked at me for a moment before answering. I don't have concrete proof of anything at this point, just patterns. But the patterns are consistent enough for us to keep looking in that direction. I left that meeting walking slowly down the street with my hands in my pockets, looking at the ground. I didn't call anyone. I didn't go to a bar to drown anything. I went to the park 3 blocks from Ruben's office. I sat on a bench and stayed there for a long time watching people pass by. I thought about my children. I thought about Angela, who at that moment was in her last year before university, with projects, with dreams, with her whole life ahead of her. I thought about David, my son, who was still a child in many ways, who still hugged me when I got home, who still asked me to sit with him to watch movies on Friday nights. And I thought that everything I'd built, all the effort, all the years, all the life, was being used against me by the same person who'd promised to be by my side. That night I got home, had dinner with the family, helped David with a math assignment, said good night to Angela, and when Adriana lay down next to me and turned off the light, I stared at the ceiling in the dark with a level of mental clarity I'd never felt before. I wasn't going to lose. I couldn't afford to lose. The following weeks were the most intense of that process. Ruben worked methodically, without hurry, but without pause, and each meeting brought something new, sometimes something small, sometimes something that hit me like a punch. I discovered, for example, that Adriana had opened a bank account in her name 2 years ago, around the same time the thing with Orlando started, at a different bank from the one we used together. Into that account, during those 2 years, periodic transfers of amounts ranging from $800 to $1,200 a month had been deposited. They weren't transfers I'd authorized. They didn't come from any account I controlled directly. Ruben followed the trail. It took him 3 weeks to complete that thread, and when he presented the results to me, I had to ask him to repeat what he'd said because I couldn't believe I was hearing it right. The money was coming from a business account, an account linked to my own company's operating expenses, expenses that had been approved by a person who had administrative access to certain funds, a trusted person, a person who'd been working with me for years. I won't say the name yet, because that part of the story has its own moment. But in that instant, sitting across from Ruben with that folder on the desk, I understood that what had started as a wife's betrayal was actually something much bigger, much more calculated, much colder. This hadn't been an accident. This had been built, planned, executed for 2 years. While I was looking the other way, I asked Ruben how much more time we needed. He told me we had enough to start building the asset protection immediately, that in parallel we'd continue documenting, that when the time came, and that time was coming, we were going to walk into that room with everything. Everything I asked. Everything, he repeated. And for the first time in weeks, something inside me settled into place. It wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was something more like determination. Like that calm that comes when you stop being afraid and start having a plan. Adriana kept coming home on Tuesdays and Thursdays with her yoga excuses. She kept leaving her phone face down. She kept looking at me during dinner with that mixture of guilt and relief that I now knew how to read perfectly, and I kept being the same Ernesto as always. I smiled. I asked how her day went. I nodded. I turned off the light, and I waited because what was still left to discover was the worst of all. And it was about to come to light. There's a point when you stop being surprised, not because the pain is gone, not because it doesn't matter anymore, but because you've been taking hits for so long that your body learns to absorb them without breaking. It becomes a kind of involuntary defense mechanism. Each new revelation arrives, passes through you, and you simply register it, file it away, and move on. That's where I was at that point. Registering, filing, moving on. Ruben had told me from the beginning that things would go from small to large, that we'd start at the edges and get to the center, that each layer we removed would reveal something deeper than the last. I'd heard him, I'd understood it in theory, but it's one thing to understand it with your head and quite another to live it week after week, meeting after meeting, folder after folder, because Ruben was right, he was always right. In that 4th week, when I arrived at his office on a Wednesday afternoon and saw that on his desk there were not 1 but 3 folders, I knew that what was coming wasn't going to be small. I sat down, he said nothing for a moment, just arranged the folders in front of me, opened the first one, and began to speak in that calm voice of his that, by that point, I found almost comforting, like the voice of someone who has everything under control, even if the world around is on fire. The first folder contained something I'd already suspected, but seeing it documented was different. Adriana had been talking to a lawyer, not the lawyer who later represented her at the hearing, another one she'd visited on 3 different occasions over the last 4 months, always in the afternoon, always on the days she was supposedly at her yoga class. The consultations had been about divorce, specifically about divorce with separation of assets and child custody. She was already planning this. It wasn't a reaction. It wasn't something she'd decided on the spur of the moment. She'd been preparing for months, consulting, building her strategy. While at home, she gave me a good morning kiss and asked if I wanted coffee. I looked at Ruben. He nodded slowly, as if confirming what I was thinking without me needing to say it out loud. There's more, he said. Second folder. The bank account we'd tracked weeks ago had more depth than we'd initially believed. It wasn't just the money that had come out of my company's operating funds. There were also movements in the other direction. For the last 14 months, Adriana had been transferring money from our joint account to her personal account. Not large amounts at once, because that would have been too visible, but small, scattered, irregular amounts. $200 one month, $400 the next, $150 after that. No fixed pattern, no set frequency, exactly like someone who knows that regular patterns draw attention. In total, in 14 months, a little over $8,000 had gone from our joint account to her personal account. $8,000 wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't nothing either. And what mattered wasn't the amount. What mattered was the method, the premeditation, the level of calculation behind each transfer. This wasn't impulsive. This was methodical. Ruben explained to me that this type of financial movement, when documented correctly and presented to a judge, has a very specific legal name and very concrete consequences. He didn't give me all the details at that moment. He just told me we had it documented, that it was in the folder, and that when the time came, that document would be one of the most important in the entire case file. He opened the 3rd folder, and that's when the ground really shifted. Ruben placed a series of documents in front of me that took me a few seconds to understand. They were emails, printed, dated, with formal headers. I looked them up and down, trying to understand where they came from, who they belonged to. He explained it to me slowly. The trusted person I mentioned before, the one who had administrative access to certain funds in my company, had been in direct communication with Orlando for at least 10 months. Not personal communication, not casual conversations, but business communication, communication in which specific aspects of my operations, my contracts, my margins, my potential clients were discussed with a level of detail that I found physically painful to read. Information that only an insider could have, information that had been used for Orlando and Orlando's company to get to certain deals before me, to offer exactly what I would have offered, but a little better, to build relationships with clients that had been mine or could have been mine. It wasn't a domestic betrayal, it was a corporate betrayal, and the two were connected, the same person, the same plan, the same network. I got up from my chair, walked to the window of Ruben's office, and stood there for a moment looking at the street without seeing anything. I breathed once, twice, 3 times. I heard the sound of the traffic outside, as if it were coming from far away. Then I turned around. How much damage did they do to the company? I asked. Ruben opened a specific page within the 3rd folder and slid the paper towards me. The conservative estimate, according to the lost contracts and the clients that had migrated to Orlando's competition in the last year and a half, was between $80 and $100. $000 in business that I should have closed and didn't. $80,000 to $100,000. I sat down again. There was a long silence in that office. Ruben didn't interrupt it. I think he knew I needed that silence, that there were things to process that couldn't be processed while someone was talking. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed late at work, trying to understand why certain contracts weren't closing. I thought of the meetings where I'd felt I came with all the preparation in the world and still something failed. I thought of the moments of doubt, of the nights I wondered if I was losing my touch, if the company was declining, if I was doing something wrong. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was being sabotaged from the inside with information I'd built over years, with the access I myself had given out of trust. I asked Ruben what would happen to that person, the one with access to the funds and information. He told me that, depending on what I wanted to do, that there was enough documentation for a civil lawsuit and possibly for a criminal complaint, that we could handle that in parallel with the divorce or afterwards, according to my judgment. That for now, the most urgent thing was to shield the company. Shield it, that word resonated with me. Ruben explained what that meant in practical terms. There were a series of legal moves that needed to be made before the divorce process formally advanced. Restructuring, legitimate transfers, documentation of intellectual property, a clear separation between my personal assets and the business assets. All within the law, all perfectly documented, all designed so that when Adriana and her lawyer arrived at the hearing demanding half of the company, they'd find something very different from what they expected. She can't anticipate this, I asked. Only if someone tells her, Ruben replied. Is there anyone who can tell her? I thought I didn't say. No one knows what we're doing. Then let's work fast. And we worked. Over the next few weeks, Ruben and I met almost every day, sometimes in his office, sometimes in neutral places, always with discretion. He directed every step, and I executed every instruction to the letter. I signed documents, reorganized structures, moved things that needed to be moved, always legally, always documented, always with a date and signature and witnesses when necessary. Meanwhile, at home, Adriana continued to be Adriana. One night, while we were having dinner, she asked me how the company was doing. I told her it was fine, that we were in a quiet period. She nodded and changed the subject. Orlando had told her the company was worth more than I was telling her. I knew this because Ruben had confirmed it. She'd consulted with her lawyer using a valuation that someone had passed to her, a valuation that was based on internal information. I smiled to myself because that valuation, that information Orlando had passed to Adriana, so she'd arrive at the hearing thinking she knew exactly what was on the table, was outdated. It was based on a structure that no longer existed, on assets that had already been reorganized. Adriana was going to arrive at that hearing convinced she knew everything and she was going to know nothing. There were a few weeks left before the hearing when Reuben looked at me during one of our meetings and asked if I was ready. I told him I was. He asked if I had any doubts, any loose ends, anything that worried me. I thought for a moment. Only one thing, I said. Are you sure it's going to work? Reuben closed his folder, took off his glasses, and looked me straight in the eye. Ernesto, he said, when that courtroom sees what we have, the only question left will be how much it's going to cost her to have underestimated a man like you. I didn't say anything, but something inside me finally settled into place. They say the calm before the storm is deceptive, that it seems like peace, but it's really accumulated tension that hasn't found its form yet. That the still air doesn't mean there's no wind, but that the wind is waiting. Contained. Ready. That was me in those last weeks before the hearing. Calm on the outside, everything accumulated on the inside. Reuben had finished shielding the company with a surgical precision that still commands my respect when I remember it. Every document was in its place. Every move was justified, dated, signed. Every piece of the case file fit with the next, as if designed by someone who'd spent decades doing exactly this. Because that's how it was. Reuben had been doing exactly this for decades, and it showed in every detail. My part was harder. My part was to keep living in that house as if nothing was wrong. And that, with everything I already knew, with everything I was carrying, had become an endurance test that no training can prepare you for. There was one night, I think it was a Friday about 3 weeks before the hearing, that Adriana came home in a particularly good mood. She was carrying a bag from an expensive store. She'd had her hair cut. She was dressed up in a way I hadn't seen her in a long time. She sat down at dinner with us, was lively with the kids, laughed at things that normally didn't amuse her. I watched her throughout that dinner, and I understood what I was seeing. She was a woman who believed her life was about to get better, that the heavy chapter was about to end, and that what came next was exactly what she'd planned. The house, the kids, the money, the freedom. Orlando. She was celebrating in advance. I didn't say anything. I poured more water into the glasses. I asked Angela how her day at school had been. I helped clear the table when we finished. And when Adriana passed by me in the kitchen and accidentally brushed my arm, I simply stepped aside and continued washing the dishes. That night, when the kids were asleep and Adriana was in the bedroom, I went down to the living room, sat on the dark sofa, and was there for a long time in silence. Not crying, not with rage, just thinking. I thought about how it had all been at the beginning. In the first years when the company was small and the apartment was tiny, and we both slept with the baby in the middle because there was no other room. In the mornings when Adriana would bring me coffee before I left, when we were still that, two people building something together, or at least that's what I thought. I wonder at what point it had broken. I didn't know. And at that point it no longer mattered to know. What mattered was what was coming. I went to sleep. The next day, I called David, my friend, and we met for coffee. It was the first time in weeks we'd spoken in person. I told him in general terms how things were, without going into details of the case file, because Reuben had asked for absolute discretion with any specific information, but I did tell him that we were ready, that it was almost time. David listened, nodded, and then asked me something no one else had asked me in all those months. How are you, Ernesto? Not the process, not the company. You. I was quiet for a moment. I'm on my feet, I finally said. That's enough, he said. And he was right. At that moment, being on my feet was enough. It was 2 weeks before the hearing when Adriana formally notified me through her lawyer that she was initiating divorce proceedings. I received the document on a Tuesday morning at the office through Reuben, who had it delivered with an attached note that simply said, "The clock starts now." I read the document. It was exactly what we expected. She was asking for full custody of the children, the house, alimony, and 50% of the company's value according to the valuation her lawyer had attached. The valuation that, as I already told you, was based on outdated information, based on a structure that no longer existed. Reuben responded within the legal deadline with a reply that was, in his words, deliberately moderate. It revealed nothing. It attacked nothing yet. It just answered the bare minimum necessary to comply with the procedural deadlines and let the other side continue to believe they were in control. And the other side continued to believe exactly that. I know what happened in those 2 weeks because later, long after it was all over, I found out some details I didn't know at the time. Adriana and Orlando had been meeting frequently. They made plans. They talked about what they'd do when the divorce was settled, when she had her share, when the life they'd been building in secret could finally come out into the open. Orlando had told her it would be easy, that I was a predictable man, that I wouldn't defend myself well, that I probably wouldn't even have a good lawyer because I never needed one and wouldn't know how to find one. That in these cases, the one who arrives more prepared wins, and they had arrived more prepared. That's what Orlando told her. And Adriana believed him because it suited her to believe him, because 19 years of marriage had given her an image of me that was real in many ways, but incomplete in one very important one. She knew me as a husband, as a father, as a provider, but she didn't know me as an adversary. She'd never had reason to see me in that role. Until now. The week before the hearing was the longest of all. The days passed slowly, as if time had decided to become heavier with each hour. I went to work, took care of my things, came home, had dinner with the kids. Everything normal, everything exactly the same as always, but there was something different that only I could feel. It was like standing on the edge of something very high, looking down, knowing that in a few days you were going to jump and that you'd checked the parachute 20 times, and it was perfect. But still, the body registered the height, and the heart beat faster than usual. One night, 4 days before the hearing, Adriana asked me if I'd received the notification from her lawyer. I told her I had. She asked me if I had a lawyer. I told her I did. There was a brief silence. Then she said to me in a voice that tried to sound neutral, but had a very particular edge, that she hoped everything could be resolved in a civilized manner, that she didn't want this to become something ugly, that in the end we both wanted what was best for the children. I looked at her, I nodded, of course. I said, I also want everything to be as clear as possible. She didn't know how to read that answer. She didn't know that as clear as possible meant something completely different to me than what she imagined. She went to her room. I stayed sitting at the kitchen table for a while longer with a cup of tea that was already cold, staring at the wall. 2 days before the hearing, I had my last meeting with Ruben. It was a long one. We went over everything document by document, point by point, in the exact order we were going to present it. Ruben was meticulous to a degree that in another context might be exhausting, but in that context, it was exactly what I needed. Every detail checked, every possible argument from the other side anticipated and answered, every piece in its place. At the end of the meeting, when we were already putting the papers away, Ruben looked at me and said something I haven't forgotten. Ernesto, tomorrow and the day after, don't do anything different. Don't change any routine. Don't say anything to anyone. Arrive at that courtroom exactly as you arrive at any business meeting, calm, prepared, and let them speak first. Why let them speak first? I asked. He smiled slightly. Because people who think they've won always talk too much, and every extra word they say will work for us. I left that office with my hands in my pockets and walked slowly to my car. It was a gray afternoon with low clouds. The kind of sky that doesn't rain, but doesn't let the light through either. I sat at the wheel without starting the engine for a few minutes. I thought about Adriana saying that this was going to be the best day of her life. I thought about Orlando smiling from the gallery with that ironic smile. I thought about everything they'd planned, about everything they thought was going to happen. And then I started the engine, left the parking lot, and went home to have dinner with my children one last time before everything changed, because the next day the show would begin, and this time the script was mine. The morning of the hearing dawned with a strange sun, one of those cold winter suns that illuminates everything but warms nothing, that comes through the window and makes you think for a second that the day will be good until you open the door and the air reminds you that it's just light, that there's no heat behind it. I got up at 6 before the alarm went off, before the house started to stir. I sat for a few minutes on the edge of the bed, in the dark with my feet on the cold floor, breathing slowly, not thinking about anything in particular, just breathing. I showered, shaved more carefully than usual, and opened the closet. I had what I was going to wear prepared from the night before. Ruben had suggested it weeks ago, almost in passing, as if it were a minor detail, but I understood it wasn't a minor detail at all. Arrive like someone who's in control, he told me. Your clothes speak before you open your mouth. A dark suit, white shirt, no tie, shoes I cleaned the night before until they were perfect. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, 48 years old, dark circles that had accumulated over 8 months of difficult nights. But my back was straight, my gaze was steady, the expression of someone who knows exactly where he stands. I went down to the kitchen. Adriana hadn't come down yet. The kids had been with my sister-in-law Marta since the night before at her house, with the excuse that it was more practical given the day we had ahead of us. It was the only thing Adriana and I agreed on during this whole process, that the children didn't have to be near any of this. I made myself a coffee, drank it standing by the window looking at the garden I'd tended for years, tree by tree, plant by plant, on weekends when there was no urgent work. It was a beautiful, quiet garden at that time of morning, with the dew still on the grass. I thought it was probably the last time I'd see it from that window, and, strangely, that didn't hurt as much as I would have expected. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Adriana came into the kitchen dressed in a way that caught my attention. She was wearing a formal navy blue suit, dressed up as if for an important interview. Her hair was up. Her makeup was careful. She wore earrings I'd given her for an anniversary, a fact I noted and kept to myself. She looked at me. I looked at her. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning," she replied. It was the last normal conversation we had in that house. 4 words in total. Then she made her tea, drank it with her back to me looking at her phone, and when she finished she grabbed her purse and said she was leaving, that her lawyer was picking her up. She left without saying anything else. I finished my coffee, washed the cup, put it out to dry, turned off the kitchen light, and went out the back door. Reuben was waiting for me in his car 2 blocks from the house, as we'd agreed. When I got in, he looked me up and down and nodded once. "Good," he said, "just that." The drive to the building where the hearing was held took 22 minutes. I know the exact time because I remember it with a clarity I don't have for many other things. Reuben drove in silence almost the whole way. Only near the end did he ask me one more time if I had any doubts, any questions, anything I needed to review. I told him no. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I'm ready." We arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time. We entered the building, went through security, went up to the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled of that institutional smell that all government buildings in the world have. A mixture of paper, disinfectant, and frozen time. We sat on the wooden bench in front of the room. 5 minutes later, Adriana arrived with her lawyer. She didn't look at me when she came in, or she did look, but in a way that was almost worse than not looking. That quick, evaluative glance someone gives you when they've already cataloged you as an obstacle about to be removed. She looked at me, processed what she saw, and averted her eyes to her lawyer to say something in his ear. Her lawyer smiled slightly. I watched them without moving a muscle. Reuben, beside me, was leafing through documents with absolute calm, as if he were reviewing the menu of a familiar restaurant. 10 minutes later, Orlando arrived, not as part of the legal process, because he wasn't a direct party. He came as support, as a spectator, as someone who'd come to watch the victory up close. He settled in the gallery, in the 2nd row, with his jacket on properly, and that posture of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. He looked for my gaze, found it, and smiled. That ironic smile I already knew, the one of someone who thinks they already know how it all ends. I didn't change my expression. I looked at him for just long enough for him to know I'd seen him, and then I looked away as if he were no one important. Because for what was about to happen in that room, Orlando was no one important. He was just a spectator who didn't yet know he'd bought a ticket to the wrong show. We were called in. The room was smaller than I'd imagined. A long table, wooden chairs, a raised platform where Judge Hortensia's desk was fluorescent light that made everything seem a bit grayer than it was, an assistant with a computer in the corner, a small window overlooking a parking lot. Nothing dramatic, nothing to announce that what was about to happen and there was something the people involved would remember for the rest of their lives. We sat down, Adriana and her lawyer on the other side of the table, Reuben and I on this side. Judge Hortensia reviewed her papers for a moment, took a sip of water, and looked up to formally open the proceedings. It was at that moment, exactly at that moment, when Adriana leaned toward her lawyer, said something, and they both laughed quietly. Then she raised her eyes to me and said in a voice that filled the entire room, "Today is the best day of my life." Judge Hortensia looked at her. The assistant stopped typing. Ruben didn't look up from his papers. Adriana wasn't finished. "I'm going to walk out of here with the house, with the kids, and with half of the company." She paused briefly and then added something she hadn't said before, something her lawyer tried to soften with a gesture she completely ignored. "Everything he has, he built with my time, with my years, with my sacrifices. He owes it to me, and today he's paying me." In the gallery, Orlando leaned back slightly in his chair with a smile on his face, his arms crossed, the gesture of someone enjoying the show. Judge Hortensia called for order with a dry voice and reminded Adriana that informal statements were not part of the procedure and that if she had something to present, she should do so through her legal representative. Adriana nodded, but didn't erase her smile. Ruben, beside me, finished arranging the last document on the table, closed the folder, and leaned toward me very slowly. His voice was barely a whisper. "Did you follow the plan to the letter?" "Yes," I answered in the same tone. "Everything, every step, every step." Ruben nodded, adjusted his glasses, and said the words I'd been waiting to hear for 8 months. "Perfect. The show begins now." And at that moment, for the first time in this whole process, for the first time since that Tuesday night when I saw that message on Adriana's phone and decided to stay quiet, for the first time since I silently carried everything I discovered, I felt something completely unexpected. Not rage, not fear, not anxiety. I felt an absolute, deep calm, the kind that only exists when you've done everything in your power and there's nothing left that depends on you, except to be present. Judge Hortensia opened the formal procedure, and the show began. Judge Hortensia had a way of speaking that left no room for disorder. Each word placed with precision, each pause exactly where it should be. She was a woman of about 60, with her gray hair tied back, dark-rimmed glasses, and an expression that revealed absolutely nothing of what she was thinking. She'd been sitting on that platform for decades, watching broken marriages, unfulfilled promises, lives that were split in two on a wooden table. And that experience had given her a neutrality that in another context might seem like coldness. But at that moment, I was deeply grateful for it, because what was about to happen needed a fair referee, and she was one. The proceedings began with the formal reading of the terms of the divorce petition filed by Adriana. Her lawyer, a man of about 45 in a gray suit and a confidence that I found increasingly interesting as the minutes passed, stood up and presented his client's position with a fluency that indicated he'd prepared that speech many times. Adriana wanted a divorce for incompatibility of character and irreversible breakdown of the marital bond. She wanted full custody of the 2 minor children with supervised visits for the father. She wanted the house that was titled in both their names. She wanted monthly alimony of $4,000, and she wanted 50% of the company's value, which according to the valuation presented by her party, amounted to a total of $620,000, meaning she was claiming $310,000 as her marital share. $310,000. Adriana's lawyer said it, with that specific intonation lawyers use when they want a figure to land with weight in the room. And it landed. The assistant wrote it down, the judge registered it, and Adriana, on the other side of the table, had her back very straight and the expression of someone who has just put her cards on the table and knows they're winners. In the gallery, Orlando didn't move, but I saw his lips form something like a satisfied smile. Judge Hortensia took a note, drank a sip of water, and then turned to Ruben. "Does the respondent wish to present his position?" Ruben stood up, and that's when the air in that room changed. Not dramatically. There was no theatrical gesture, no raised voice, no grandiloquent statement. Ruben simply stood up, opened his folder, and began to speak in that calm, precise voice I'd learned to recognize as the voice of someone who has everything exactly where he needs it. He said that the respondent did not oppose the divorce. Adriana's lawyer raised an almost imperceptible eyebrow. She blinked once. Ruben continued. He said that regarding the custody of the minors, the respondent had important observations to present at the appropriate time and requested that custody be shared equally, with the father as an active and present figure in the lives of both children. So far, nothing unexpected. Then Reuben said that regarding the house, the respondent requested a review of the current status of the mortgages, liens, and debts linked to the property before any allocation, given that there were relevant elements that the valuation presented by the other party did not contemplate. Adriana's lawyer frowned slightly. Adriana glanced at him, and then Reuben said the following. He said that regarding the company's valuation presented by the plaintiff, the respondent had formal and documented objections and requested a complete review of said valuation in light of information that would be presented to the court in this very act. A brief pause. Likewise, Reuben continued, the respondent requests that a series of documents be incorporated into the record that are relevant to accurately determine not only the real value of the assets in dispute, but also the conduct of the plaintiff during the marital period in relation to said assets. Judge Hortensia looked at him over her glasses. Documents of what nature? Reuben didn't hesitate for a second. Financial documents, digital communications, bank records, and evidence of conduct that the court needs to be aware of to issue a fair and complete ruling. Silence. Adriana's lawyer stood up immediately. Your Honor, the respondent did not present any advance of this documentation within the established procedural deadlines, and Judge Hortensia raised a hand. Let him finish. Adriana's lawyer sat down slowly, his jaw slightly clenched. Adriana looked at him, whispered something to him. He replied in a very low voice. And I saw for the first time that whole morning something different on Adriana's face. It wasn't worry yet. It was a small, almost invisible doubt, like a microscopic crack in a wall that, until that moment, had seemed solid. Reuben took the first document from his folder and handed it to the assistant to be formally registered. The first element the court should consider, said Reuben, is that the valuation presented by the plaintiff is based on the business structure as it existed approximately 14 months ago. However, said structure has been modified legitimately and completely documented during that period, which significantly alters the numbers that have been presented today. Adriana's lawyer intervened again. Your Honor, any modification made during the separation process could constitute ordinary administration of the business. Reuben interrupted with absolute calm. As long as it's documented, dated, and carried out within the current legal framework, which is exactly the case. Every move is backed up. He handed over a second document, then a third, each with its date, each with its signature, each one perfectly in order. Judge Hortensia reviewed them one by one with her meticulousness that rushed for nothing and no one. Adriana's lawyer had leaned toward her, and the two were whispering with an urgency that hadn't been there before. Adriana's back was no longer so straight. I didn't notice it all at once. I noticed it gradually, like when the air slowly escaped from something that seemed inflated. Her posture, her shoulders, her expression. Everything began to change subtly, but really. Reuben continued. The second element the court should consider, he said, extracting a new section of documents, is of a financial nature and directly affects the valuation of the marital assets. He paused deliberately. For a period of 14 months between the date on these records and the present moment, the plaintiff made systematic transfers from the joint bank account to a personal account in her exclusive name, without the knowledge or authorization of the respondent. The room fell completely silent. Judge Hortensia stopped writing. The total amount of said transfers, Reuben continued in the same voice as always, without raising it a single tone, amounts to $8,400. The complete documentation of each transfer with date, amount, and destination account is included in Appendix 3 of the file we've just submitted. Adriana's lawyer stood up, this time with more urgency than before. Your Honor, my client. Sit down, said Judge Hortensia. She didn't shout. She didn't say it aggressively, just with an authority that left no room for debate. The lawyer sat down. Adriana's eyes were fixed on the table in front of her. She wasn't looking at anyone anymore. She no longer had the expression of someone who's winning. She had the expression of someone who has just heard something she didn't expect to hear and is still processing the implications. In the gallery, Orlando had stopped smiling. He was still sitting in the same spot with his arms crossed, but something in his posture had changed. He'd sat up slightly. The relaxed gesture from before was gone. In its place was something more like attention, vigilance. Reuben took another section of documents. The third element, he said, is the one the court may find most relevant in determining the totality of the circumstances surrounding this divorce petition. I glanced at him for a second. He didn't look back at me. His eyes were on his papers, on the judge, on the room, completely focused, completely in his element. There are documented communications between the plaintiff and a third party, who is known to this court for his presence in the gallery, in which operational, contractual, and strategic aspects of the respondent's company are discussed in detail. Orlando tensed. I saw it from where I was. I saw how his arms, which until that moment were crossed in that pose of a man watching something that amuses him, tightened slightly. I saw how his jaw changed. I saw how his eyes moved towards Adriana with a speed that betrayed something that until that moment had been very well hidden. Fear. Reuben continued without looking up. These communications, which extend over a period of 10 months, include information about clients, bids, operating margins, and business strategies of the respondent's company. Information that would have been used systematically to benefit a competing company directly linked to the aforementioned third party. Adriana looked up, and for the first time that whole morning, in all those months, in all those years perhaps, she looked at me for real, not with indifference, not with calculated guilt. She looked at me with something I hadn't expected to see, with disbelief, as if she couldn't believe I knew all that. As if the image she had of me, the predictable Ernesto, the one who didn't ask questions, the one who trusted too much, was crumbling in real time before her eyes. I held her gaze without rage, without satisfaction yet, just with the calm of someone who's been waiting for exactly this moment for 8 months. Reuben placed the last document of that section on the table and addressed the judge. Your Honor, this is just the beginning of what we have to present today. And Judge Hortensia, who hadn't changed her expression during all that time, leaned back slightly in her chair, clasped her hands in front of her, and looked at Adriana's lawyer with a question in her eyes that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Adriana's lawyer had no answer yet, but the worst for them was about to begin. There's a moment when an entire room changes sides. It's not something you can pinpoint exactly. There's no precise instant, no specific word, no concrete document that causes it. It's something that happens cumulatively, like water rising slowly until suddenly you realize you can no longer touch the bottom. That moment arrived in that room, and I saw it. I saw exactly how the weight of the room shifted from one side of the table to the other, slowly but irreversibly, like a scale finding its true level after being artificially tilted for too long. Adriana's lawyer had requested a brief recess to consult with his client. Judge Hortensia granted it with a gesture that said she knew exactly what would happen when it resumed. Reuben and I stayed in our seats. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. He reviewed his notes once more with his usual meticulousness, and I sat still with my hands on the table, looking ahead. In the corner of the room, Adriana and her lawyer were talking in low voices with an urgency they hadn't had upon entering. She was frowning. He was explaining something to her with controlled gestures, his open hand moving slowly, his voice too low to hear, but the tone perfectly legible from a distance. It was the tone of someone recalibrating in real time, reviewing a strategy that no longer works, looking for where on the board he still has useful pieces. In the gallery, Orlando was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the table with an expression that had completely lost its earlier irony. In its place was something rawer, more real. The expression of someone who came to see a victory and is beginning to understand that he might have bought the wrong ticket. The session resumed. Judge Hortensia addressed Reuben with her voice that didn't ask, but simply established. You may continue with the presentation of the remaining elements. Reuben stood up. Thank you, Your Honor. He opened the next section of his folder, and what came next was, in my memory, the most precise and devastating part of everything we'd prepared over those 8 months. Reuben presented the records of the trusted person, the one with administrative access to my company's funds, the the one who'd been in direct communication with Orlando for 10 months, passing him internal information. He presented the emails. He presented the transfer records. He presented the comparative analysis that an independent accountant had prepared, showing the correlation between the dates of those communications and the dates I'd lost specific contracts to Orlando's company. It wasn't speculation, it was math. Every email had a date. Every lost contract had a date. Every coincidence was documented with the precision of someone who'd spent weeks building that argument stone by stone. Adriana's lawyer tried to object twice. The first time, Judge Hortensia let him finish his objection and then asked Ruben to respond, which he did with an ease that indicated he'd anticipated that exact objection. The second time, the judge raised her hand before the lawyer finished formulating it. "The documentation is in order," the judge said. "Continue." Adriana's eyes were downcast. She wasn't looking at her lawyer. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at a fixed point on the table in front of her with an expression I'd never seen on her face in 19 years of marriage. It was an expression of defeat, not the dramatic defeat of movies, with tears and exaggerated gestures. It was the silent, real defeat of someone who understands in a concrete moment, with no possibility of denial, that the plan they built so carefully over so long is crumbling before their eyes, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. Ruben reached the last block of documents, the most important one, the one we'd saved for last, not out of whim, but because it had the most specific weight, the one that most definitively changed the balance of everything being discussed in that room. Ruben presented the real and updated valuation of the company, prepared by an independent expert hired by us, based on the current structure and not the one that existed 14 months ago. The number was significantly different from the one Adriana's lawyer had presented at the beginning of the hearing, not because the company was worth less in absolute terms, but because the structure had been legitimately reorganized and what remained within the marital scope was a fraction of what Adriana had calculated existed. $310,000 had become, according to the real and updated valuation, a considerably smaller figure. Adriana's lawyer turned pale. Not dramatically, just that subtle change in skin color that happens when something you thought was solid dissolves under your feet. He tried to argue that the reorganization had been done in bad faith to evade marital obligations. Ruben had an answer for that, too. Every reorganization move was dated before the formal start of the divorce proceedings. Every decision was documented as part of the ordinary administration of the business. There wasn't a single element that could be interpreted as an evasive maneuver because it wasn't. It was simply a man who had managed his company well within the law, with all the documentation in order. Judge Hortensia studied the documents for several minutes in silence. The entire room waited. Adriana kept her eyes down. Her lawyer had an expression that tried to remain neutral but didn't quite succeed. And Orlando in the gallery had leaned back in his chair again, but no longer with the same pose. It was the posture of someone who wants to appear calm and isn't. Then the judge spoke, and what she said in the following minutes was, in legal terms, a clear and direct enumeration of the implications of what Ruben had presented. Regarding the $8,400 transferred without authorization from a joint account, the judge noted that this would have direct consequences on the settlement of assets and could be subject to additional legal action outside the divorce process. Regarding the documentation on the use of confidential business information, the judge noted that this exceeded the scope of the divorce and that the respondent had the right and perhaps the obligation to present that documentation to the appropriate authorities to determine if civil or criminal liability existed. And regarding the custody of the minors, the judge said that before issuing any ruling she needed to carefully review all the elements presented, but that the mother's request for sole custody was suspended pending further evaluation. Adriana looked up at that moment and looked at me, not with rage, not with hatred, with something much more complicated than that, with that specific mixture of disbelief and recognition that someone has when they understand, truly understand, that they completely underestimated the person in front of them. She'd seen me for 19 years as the man who worked, who didn't ask questions, who trusted too much, who was predictable, and I had been until I decided not to be anymore. Her lawyer asked for the floor to make one last intervention. The judge granted it. He spoke for 3 minutes with the professionalism of someone who knows he's losing but has an obligation to defend his client to the end. He presented some counterarguments that Reuben answered with the same calm as always, without raising his voice, without any gesture of triumph, just with data, with dates, with documents. When the exchange was over, Judge Hortensia closed her folder, clasped her hands in front of her, and looked at both sides of the table with that look of hers that revealed nothing but contained everything. This court will issue its formal ruling within the period established by law, she said. However, in light of what has been presented today, I anticipate that the initial conditions requested by the plaintiff will hardly be sustained in the terms proposed. Brief pause. Both parties will receive formal notification. The session is adjourned. The sound of the gavel on the table echoed in that small room like something much bigger than it was. Adriana didn't move for a few seconds. Her lawyer said something in her ear. She nodded mechanically, gathered her things, stood up, and before walking through the door, she stopped for a moment. She didn't look at me directly this time. She just stood there for a second with her hand on the door frame, her back to me, as if she wanted to say something and couldn't find the words. Then she left. Orlando followed her without looking at me, and I remained seated in that wooden chair, in that room that smelled of paper and fluorescent light, while Reuben packed away his documents with the same tranquility he'd entered with. And I felt that something that had been tight in the center of my chest for 8 months, something hard and heavy and constant, was slowly letting go. It wasn't joy yet. It was something before joy. It was the end of something that had been very long and very heavy, and the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. Legal rulings don't arrive suddenly. They arrive slowly in formal documents with dates and seals and language that sometimes seems designed to make everything sound less real than it is. They arrive by mail through the lawyer, in envelopes you put on the table, and open with a calm you didn't have months ago, because you no longer need to brace for the blow. You already know what's inside. You've already done the work. The ruling arrived 23 days after the hearing. Reuben called me that morning before I opened the envelope. He told me he'd already reviewed it, and it was exactly what we'd expected. He told me to take my time reading it, that if I had questions I should call him, and that when I was ready we'd celebrate with a coffee. I hung up, opened the envelope, read it twice. Custody of Angela and David would be shared equally, with a schedule agreed upon by both parties and court supervision during the first year. No sole custody for Adriana. No supervised visits for me. Shared custody, as I'd requested from the beginning, because it was fair and because the documentation had made it clear that I was a present and responsible father. The house would undergo a settlement process that considered the property's real debts, including the outstanding mortgage, which significantly reduced the net disputed value. The result was much less favorable for Adriana than what she'd calculated when she walked into that room, convinced she was taking everything. Regarding the company, the valuation presented by Reuben was the one that prevailed. Not Orlando's outdated valuation, the real, current one. What Adriana received as her marital share was a fraction of the $310,000 she'd claimed with such certainty that morning. And regarding the unauthorized transfers of $8,400, the ruling established that this amount would be deducted directly from Adriana's corresponding settlement, plus applicable interest. I folded the document, put it on the table, poured myself a coffee, and called my kids. Angela answered first. I told her I wanted to see them that weekend, that I had things to tell them, that we were going to be okay. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then she said in that voice of hers that sometimes sounds more mature than a 16-year-old should, that she already knew, that she'd always known we were going to be okay. I had to let a few seconds pass before I could answer her. David, my son, asked if we could go for pizza that weekend. I said yes. He said good, that he'd order the pepperoni, and just like that, with a conversation about pizza, something inside me finally settled into a place it hadn't been in a long time. What came after with Adriana wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't what she expected either. I think she expected me to react with rage now that it was all over, to confront her, to tell her everything I hadn't said during those 8 months. She expected the explosion that never came while we lived under the same roof, and that perhaps she thought had only been postponed. But there was no explosion. I sent her a message through Ruben, as was appropriate, indicating the terms of the custody schedule for the coming weeks. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, just logistics, just what Angela and David needed to know to organize their lives with the least amount of turbulence possible. Adriana responded through her lawyer, and so the new language between us was established. Not the language of two people who loved each other for years and then hurt each other, but the neutral, functional language of two people who share children and who have decided, or in my case, consciously chosen, that hatred is too expensive to maintain. The matter of the trusted person, the one who'd leaked information from my company to Orlando, I handled separately and with the same methodical coldness I'd learned during those months. Ruben connected me with a lawyer specializing in commercial law. We presented the documentation. The process took time, as all legal matters do, but the result was a compensation that didn't recover everything lost, but was significant enough to close that chapter with something resembling justice. Orlando disappeared from the map. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no scene, no cinematic moment where I looked him in the eyes and said something forceful. He simply ceased to exist in my world. His company lost several contracts in the following months. Some of them were clients who had migrated to him using my information and who, once the situation became clear in the relevant circles, preferred to go back to working with someone whose way of doing business didn't raise questions. The business world is small, reputations travel fast, and Orlando's did. Adriana and Orlando's thing ended, as I learned much later through channels I didn't actively seek a few months after the hearing. I don't know the details, and I didn't want to know. I just know that the life they'd planned together, the one they'd built in secret for 2 years at the expense of everything I'd built, didn't turn out to be what they expected when it stopped being a secret and became the daily reality with all its complications. Things built on lies have that characteristic. They hold up as long as the lie holds up. When the truth arrives, the entire structure trembles. My life, after all that, wasn't a movie ending. There was no music. There was no perfect sunset, no moment when everything suddenly clicked and the pain disappeared as if it had never been there. There was work, there were difficult nights, especially the first weeks without the kids at home. That particular silence a house has when the people who filled it are not there. There were mornings when I sat down to have breakfast alone and the silence weighed more heavily than usual. There were moments when I wondered if there was anything I could have done differently, not to save the marriage, but to have reached that point with less accumulated damage. But there were other things too. There was a Friday night when Angela and David were with me, and the three of us stayed up late watching a movie, and I fell asleep on the sofa, and when I woke up they covered me with a blanket without waking me. There was a morning when I got to the company and closed a major contract I hadn't been able to close for months because there was no longer anyone leaking information out. There was a call from David, my friend, where he asked how I was, and for the first time in a long time, I could answer with something more than just on my feet. I could tell him good, really good. The company grew, not suddenly, not spectacularly, but the way things grow when the ground is solid again, and you can build on it without someone removing the foundations while you sleep. Contract by contract, client by client, with the same work as always, but this time without filters, without sabotage, without information traveling where it shouldn't. One day, months after everything was over, I went to the park near Ruben's office, the same park where I'd sat that afternoon after finding out about the corporate espionage, when the weight of everything I discovered had made me need air and silence and a bench to sit and breathe. I sat on the same bench, watched people pass by for a while, and thought about everything that had happened since the last time I was there. The months of silence, the meetings with Ruben, the documents, the records, the folders, the hearing, the look on Adriana's face when she understood that I knew everything, the look on Orlando's face when the ironic smile fell off and he couldn't hold it. I thought about my kids. I thought about what I had left, and I realized something I probably should have known before, but you only truly understand when you've lived it from the inside. The biggest betrayal wasn't that Adriana cheated on me. It wasn't that Orlando used my information. It wasn't the money or the company or the lost contracts. The biggest betrayal was the time, the years I spent trusting in something that wasn't what I thought it was, the work I did convinced I was building for everyone, when in reality, I was only building. But here's the truth that remained when everything settled. Everything I built with my own hands, with my years, with my decisions. And when they took everything they could from me, I was left with the most important thing, with my children, with my work, with my name intact, with the certainty that when the time came to defend myself, I didn't react on impulse or act out of rage. I waited, I documented, I planned, and I entered that room not as a broken man seeking revenge, but as someone who simply wanted the truth to take its rightful place. There are people who confuse silence with weakness, who see a man who doesn't shout and think he's a man who doesn't know. Adriana made that mistake and learned in the most costly way possible that the silence of a man who is building his response isn't weakness. It's the most dangerous calm there is.